Coca-Cola dominated the soda industry since its development in the early 1900s. But by the mid-1980s, Coca-Cola saw its sales slipping, and Pepsi overtook Coca-Cola as the #1 soda brand in the United States. In reaction, Coca-Cola made an unprecedented move. They changed their formula to taste more and more like Pepsi and rebranded their soft drink as New Coke. Coca-Cola's efforts to reformulate and rebrand flopped. No one was buying or drinking New Coke. So how did they recover? Well, they went back to their roots. They changed their formula to as close to its original recipe as possible and went back to the original Coca-Cola brand. And it worked. The masses loved it, and Coca-Cola regained its spot at the top of the soda market. So what can we learn from Coca-Cola's failure and subsequent rebound strategy of finding success by going back to their roots? Well, I'm here to propose to you that North Dakota can do the same thing. We can catalyze a more prosperous rural North Dakota by going back to our small-scale farming roots and repurposing vacant or idle farmsteads to spur a modern homesteading movement. Now, before we talk about a modern homesteading movement, we need to go back in time to understand the Homestead Act and its impact on what will become our station's economy, population, and way of life. And as we go back in time, it's critical to underscore that North Dakota and the Great Plains had been populated for thousands of years by indigenous peoples. And we also have to recognize that the success of North Dakota and the Homestead Act is built on this unjust allotment of tribal lands. And while this is an incredibly important and often untold story, that is not the story I'm going to tell today. However, having the recognition of this history allows us to view a modern homesteading movement through a lens of equity and inclusion to assure that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated in the efforts of the future. Now, the United States Homestead Act was signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863. This act gave 160 acres of free land to any person who lived on that land and farmed it for 5 years. The first homestead claim was made in what will become North Dakota in 1868, and by 1915, North Dakota had already experienced 2 population booms, with nearly all of North Dakota being settled by European Americans, and with the peak year for homesteading being 1908, when 14,287 homestead claims were filed. Now, as homesteading grew, small towns popped up all over North Dakota, with 355 cities filing incorporation papers by 1915. By 1942, there were 2,272 school districts, many of which were one-room schoolhouses. This number was then right-sized by 1962 to 986 modern school districts. Grocery stores and food markets were abundant, and our main streets were bustling with activity. So what was driving all of this activity? Well, it was agriculture. By 1920, the average size of a farm grew from 160 acres to 466 acres, and the number of farms in operation in North Dakota at that time was 77,690. At the same time, over 60% of North Dakota's population lived on a family farm. Now, with every population boom comes a subsequent population decline. And North Dakota's population decline accelerated well into the 1980s and finally bottomed out in 2003, where the entire population loss for the state overtopped 7%. By the early 2000s, less than 3.5% of college graduates were staying in North Dakota. Birth rates declined, more and more buildings on our main streets became vacant, and our proportion of seniors began a quick and steady incline. Schools and school districts began to consolidate, and ghost towns started to emerge. Now, as we look at North Dakota today, I feel it's important to introduce what I think are 3 distinct North Dakota zones, with western North Dakota benefiting from the resurgence of the oil and gas industry and increased population, while eastern North Dakota's I-29 corridor is becoming more urbanized. If we look at where our more agriculturally dependent communities are located, it's right within that central North Dakota corridor. And it's within the central North Dakota corridor that we are seeing more and more clearly the continued impacts of outmigration and the loss of small family farms. For example, if you will recall, by 1962, there were 986 separate school districts. By 2019, only 244 school districts remain. Food access is challenging and food deserts are common in rural North Dakota, with North Dakota's rural communities losing 20% of their grocery stores since 2013. So why is this happening? Well, the average size of a farm grew from 466 acres in 1920 to 1,506 acres today, which is due partly to advances in technology, which decreases the number of people needed to work on a farm. So bigger farms are operating, but they need less people to work them. Further, conventional farming is expensive. It is estimated that in order to begin farming conventionally, at least $1.8 million in capital would be needed. This means if you don't have a family lineage to a conventional farmer or otherwise are connected to a conventional farmer, you're basically priced out from the beginning. And this is leading to farmers getting older. The average age of a farmer is 59.4, and young producers, ages 35 and under, only account for 9% of the farming population. So, to recap, we've gone from 77,690 farms in 1920 to 31,000 farms in 2012 to 26,000 farms in 2018, leaving thousands of vacant or idle farmsteads underused throughout our state. So how do we mitigate this trend? How do we look past all of North Dakota's identified gaps or deficits to find those pockets of opportunity that we can innovate around? How can we think differently about North Dakota's abundance of vacant or idle farmsteads? Well, what if, instead of viewing these farmsteads as worn and tired homes, we viewed them as spaces with access to infrastructure and with the potential to support small-scale operations? Significant investments have already been made in these spaces, and we can leverage those investments. What if we could create a land trust ownership model with incentives for landowners to sell or donate their vacant or idle farmsteads? With a land trust ownership model, we could keep those farmsteads permanently affordable housing, where a community-controlled nonprofit organization retains ownership of the land and then sells or rents the farmstead on that land to a lower income or otherwise underserved farmer, permanently removing a large-scale barrier to entry for those seeking to farm. What if we went back to our micro-farming roots while also embracing new tools and technologies to extend our growing seasons and increase our yields? Now, many of you may be wondering, what is a micro-farm? A micro-farm is a small patch of land, usually 5 to 7 acres, where a farmer grows a variety of foods in an efficient, mindful way. Micro-farms either feed the farmer or make a profit at a market. Micro-farming operations either sell through a CSA, a community-supported agriculture, or directly to or through a farmer's market. And the main strength of micro-farming operations is that they grow a wide variety of crops and livestock by taking advantage of every nook, cranny, and all that the land has to offer. Now, micro-farming isn't a new practice. We've been doing this for centuries, and this method of farming is most similar to what our first-generation homesteaders practiced. New tools and technologies like high tunnels and hydroponics can support our micro-farmers to increase their yields without dramatically increasing their input costs. Now, there are 3 distinct differences between micro-farming and conventional farming, and with the first being the scale at which they operate. While conventional farms may need thousands of acres of productivity in order to cash flow, many micro-farms can do so with less than 10 acres because of the greater yield per acre. The second difference is the level of input costs required. As previously mentioned, conventional farming startup costs can be enormous, upwards of $1.8 million, and ongoing equipment upgrades can easily overtop $250,000 per piece of machinery. With the methods practiced with microfarming, input costs and ongoing equipment costs are much less. And the third difference is the market to which either sells. While a conventional farmer will often sell to a large distribution entity, like elevators or other cash crop brokers, microfarmers will sell much more locally to grocery stores, restaurants, or directly to consumers. Now, these three simplified differences aren't meant to downplay just how difficult it can be to be a microfarmer and to live in a converted farmstead. But this brings me to my fourth and final what if. What if we could provide ongoing homesteading supports that were inclusive and culturally responsive so that this modern homesteading movement doesn't look like the homesteading movement of the past, which was dominated by European Americans? By looking at a modern homesteading movement through a lens of equity and inclusion, we can develop wraparound services so that new Americans or Native Americans can be supported to succeed by leveraging and linking together already available and operating service providers. So why do we think this is the best approach? Well, it's a win-win. Repurposing vacant or idle farmsteads removes a large-scale barrier to entry that many potential or underserved farmers experience every day. Further, the infrastructure investment has already been made. It's just not being used. Now, will there be challenges? Absolutely. Some of the more common challenges cited by small farmers, which often deters people from even wanting to attempt to farm, includes a lack of channels for distribution and aggregation, and North Dakota's short growing season can be problematic. However, momentum is in our favor. Significant investments are already being made to raise awareness of these issues and organize solutions, so these challenges aren't insurmountable. Do you still have doubts that modern homesteading and microfarming can't be done in today's environment? Then consider Mirek and Julia Petrovic. Mirek and Julia were accomplished individuals living on the East Coast when they decided that they wanted to live a different life. Fed up with the hustle and bustle, they sought a way of life that would let them connect with the land, get back to their roots, and raise their children differently. Mirek and Julia purchased a small farm just outside of Rugby a few years ago and began a small farming operation, working first to feed their family and then selling any leftover produce at a farmer's market. As they became more successful, they purchased the vacant former post office building in Animus and created a restaurant and food hub, where they coordinate the buying and selling of produce with local farmers and turn the leftover produce into delicious homemade meals. The potential benefits of a modern homesteading movement could far outweigh any potential challenges. By repurposing vacant or idle farmsteads, we can increase our rural populations and strengthen our rural economies. We can preserve investments already made in infrastructure and rebuild robust local food systems. We could even go so far as to say that a modern homesteading movement in North Dakota could help us to mitigate climate change by increasing the resilience of our soil, cutting food miles and transportation pollution by keeping our food local, increasing land and water conservation efforts, and cultivating new opportunities for green energy. And it's not just North Dakota that could bet on this opportunity. Other communities are betting on this approach too. Consider Marne, Iowa. Marne is a small town with a population of 120 people that is giving away free land to anyone willing to build a home there. Within 36 hours of the program going live, the city of Marne had over 7,000 website hits, and they had to disconnect their phone line because they couldn't keep up with the demand. And they are showing us that the demand for a modern homesteading movement is there. Now, a modern homesteading movement wouldn't be the first time North Dakota communities balanced old solutions with new problems. We do it all the time. For example, in Benson County, the community of Maddock revitalized a dilapidated building on their main street into a multi-use facility by restoring it back to its historic Opera House roots, which is supported financially by a community-owned restaurant, bar, and coffee shop. And in Kidder County, the small town of Tuttle, with a population of approximately 60 people, is converting its vacant school building into the Tuttle Rural Innovation Center, which is a small business incubator, event space, makerspace, and food hub. So many times as we try to address problems in our communities, we want a solution that is bright, shiny, and new. We want to take the new Coke approach and change our formula. But what if, instead of looking at our neighborhoods, communities, and regions as areas of persistent need, we looked at them as pockets of opportunity, navigating the assets and talent that we already have? What lessons have historical solutions already taught us? I'm the product of multiple lines of homesteaders from the heart of central North Dakota. My great-grandpa Casper even homesteaded in an abandoned rail car. I know we can spur change through a modern homesteading movement. And as you leave here today, I ask you to reframe how you're thinking about change in your community. Are you only looking at the deficits or gaps within your community? Are you only looking at other communities in envy instead of recognizing the assets that you already have? Or are you keeping your eyes out for those historical gems that you can innovate around? What can be your town's modern homesteading movement? Thank you.